Hello, this presentation was presented at the Vermont Care Partners virtual conference on March 10th, 2022. However, the presentation was inadvertently not recorded. The conference organizers asked me if I would independently record the presentation to make it available to conference attendees, and I agreed to do so. So you can think of this as the encore presentation. Today's presentation is Overcoming Racial Bias in the Delivery of Mental Health Services, or I should say that is the title of today's presentation. Of course, when you propose conference ideas in response to a call for proposals, you can be very ambitious, but when you are actually sitting down to flesh out the details of that presentation, you realize you might have been a little overly ambitious. And that is all to say that the title really reflects my aspiration for this presentation. And of course, in 1 hour, I do not believe that you can overcome racial bias in the delivery of mental health services, but it's my aspiration that you at least leave this presentation with a greater understanding of how issues of race, racial bias, and bias in general may arise in the delivery of mental health services. So my name is Wilda White, and I am currently a management consultant. I have a law degree and a business degree, and I've worked as both an attorney and a businesswoman running for-profit and nonprofit businesses. I'm also currently the founder and director of Mad Freedom, which is a human and civil rights advocacy organization whose mission is to end the discrimination and oppression of people based on their perceived mental state. I was formerly the executive director of Vermont Psychiatric Survivors, and I've practiced law for a great deal in my life. And what you probably notice is that I'm not a clinician. I'm not a mental health clinician. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a psychiatrist. And what you're going to hear today is really based on my expertise as a patient or client. And I think it's important to bring that experience into a conference like this, because as far as I know, training of mental health practitioners is really a closed loop. You get information from your supervisors or others who are in similar roles to you, but you seldom, if ever, get feedback from a patient or client. And so that's the perspective that I'm bringing here today. I want to share one former patient's perspective of what's going on with the patient or client in the consulting room, particularly when there are issues of race or gender that are also at play. I do consider myself a psychiatric survivor, and I define that for myself as someone who has been harmed from the mental health system. So in the examples that you see today, I'm providing some of the ways that I feel like I have been harmed by the mental health system through its failure to take into account that I have been labeled in this society based on my race and my gender, and the harm that I endured really because the practitioners that I'm going to be talking about today didn't take into account those issues. So the learning objectives of today's presentation are really to understand how you may begin to recognize your own racial biases or just your gaps in knowledge based on not having maybe a full command of how race plays out for your patient or client or in the larger society. It's to understand how those gaps in knowledge or those biases that you may not be aware of can harm patients or clients, and to begin to acquire some tools for not inflicting harm or suffering from harm if you're a patient or client based on those knowledge gaps that occur in the therapeutic alliance. Now, when I talk about biases, and I'll mention this a little later, but I want to just let you know now that I'm not talking about, racial hostility. I'm not talking about, bigotry and, prejudice. I'm talking really about things that you may not be aware of, things that you have the best of intentions, but just because of just limitations in knowledge or what you've been exposed to, you don't understand how things that you don't know may be playing out in the consulting room, based on race or gender or other ways that our society has figured out how to other us and marginalize us. So this presentation will really be broken up into two different sections. The first, I'm going to talk a little bit about epistemic injustice. I'll explain what that is and why I'm talking about it. And then I'm going to go through like 3 stages of the mental health services delivery process, where I think issues of bias can arise. And I'm going to walk you through an intake example, a documentation example, and a diagnosis and treatment example. But before we begin with going through the delivery of mental health services, I want to give you a framework that I often use, and I think is very helpful when we think about the delivery of mental health services. And the frame is epistemic injustice. And before I can talk to you about epistemic injustice, I feel like I should start at the very beginning and talk to you about where that word epistemic comes from. It comes from the word epistemology. And if you're like me, your eyes may already be glazing over, because I remember even when I was working in academia, I would hear my colleagues say the word epistemology and my eyes would glaze over and I was not interested in anything they had to say. But I've come to really appreciate epistemology and the philosophy of epistemology, because I think it's really valuable in understanding, particularly as a psychiatric survivor, why the things that we'll talk about here today, how those things came to happen, how I came to be harmed. So epistemology is a branch of philosophy that asks, what is knowledge? How is knowledge acquired? What do people know? And how do we know what we know? And it's important to distinguish between knowledge and beliefs. So when I use the term knowledge, I'm talking about things that are factual. And beliefs are things that can be true or false. It's just simply what we hold to be true. But it's not factual. And the distinction is really important because I often hear people now talking about how when they hear a fact, they will say they don't believe it. And it's become a very popular way of dismissing people or ideas simply by saying, I don't believe it. I think in American society, we tend to respect people's beliefs, or at least that's the ideology. We allow people to believe what they want to believe. It's enshrined in our Constitution that you're entitled to your beliefs. And I think because of that, when people say they don't believe things that are factual, we tend not to challenge it because beliefs we tend to respect. And we actually don't have a good handle on epistemology to understand that when someone is saying they don't believe a fact, that's very different from when someone is saying they have an opinion about something that's not factual. So to give you just a little brief example, which I'll talk about in greater detail later, I was attending a hearing in the House Healthcare Committee, and there was a witness who was testifying about medical doctors and how they discount pain when reported by Black patients. And she was referring to a peer-reviewed research report that demonstrated that medical doctors had a different way that they approached treating pain when reported by a Black patient versus when it was reported by a white patient. essentially, oftentimes they think Black patients either don't feel pain the same way as white patients, or they think Black patients are exaggerating their pain because they're drug seeking. And this legislator piped up and said he didn't believe it. He didn't believe the research study. And that's an example of, here's something factual, and he didn't believe it. And it turned out he didn't believe it because he didn't believe that doctors could be racist. And so that's an example of how people are now using their beliefs to dismiss facts and also dismiss the creation of knowledge, dismiss what our society considers to be knowledge, that thing where I talked about how we know what we know. So it's actually very powerful strategy to perpetuate ignorance or to perpetuate power, because you limit the creation of knowledge. And when you do that, you actually limit the power of people who have knowledge that you don't want to become widespread or shared. So what is epistemic injustice? I've given you a hint about it, but it was a term that was coined by a philosopher named Miranda Fricker in 2007 to describe the harm that results when, because of prejudice, a person is deprived of her capacity as a knower or interpreter of her own experience. And this is virtually the definition that Miranda Fricker uses. And so I'm going to give some examples to make it more concrete so you actually know what I'm talking about. At its simplest, epistemic injustice happens when, because of prejudice, you don't believe something that somebody tells you. For example, that legislator I talked to you about who didn't believe the peer-reviewed research, that would be an example of epistemic injustice, where the way he tried to dismiss the knowledge was to say he didn't believe it, based on nothing more than wanting to hold on to his preconceived notions about racism and whether or not it exists. And I think it's important here to talk briefly about what I mean by prejudice, because it's not, like I'm saying, like what we think of as bigotry, or just people who are, flat out say they don't like people of a different race or religion or gender. It's something that can be both conscious and unconscious. And I'm using it really just to mean a resistance to counter evidence of a firmly held belief. And so in that example of the legislator, he had a firmly held belief that, there was no racism in medicine. And even when confronted with peer-reviewed research that demonstrated that there was, he simply resisted it without any factual or rational basis for doing so. And so that's what I'm really talking about when I talk about prejudice. It can include other forms of prejudice, of course, but it also includes just a resistance to counter evidence. Another example to just get away from that legislator is, oftentimes I'll read an article in the New York Times. It will have to do with somebody who may have committed a crime or harmed somebody. And they'll mention that the person is suspected or has or may have a mental illness. And they'll cite the literature that says that there's no connection between mental illness and violence. But they won't stop there. They'll say, but maybe there is, or it's not clear. And so I would call that kind of reporting also a form of epistemic injustice, because even though they've cited the research, they raise a doubt about the research without any factual basis for doing so. So there are two types of epistemic injustice. There's testimonial injustice and there's hermeneutical injustice. And I'll break these down beginning with hermeneutical injustice, beginning with testimonial injustice, which I've given you a preview of already. So testimonial injustice is when you don't believe what somebody says just because you're prejudiced against them, whether you know it or not. You may value the opinion of men more than women, or white or black, or adults versus children. For any variety of reasons, you may have a prejudice. You may not even like the tone of the person's voice. Whatever it is, if you simply just don't believe that speaker based on this kind of preconceived notion, that would be an example of testimonial injustice. And testimonial injustice is broader than just the word testimony. It includes the full range of speech acts. So it includes if someone's asked a question and it just gets ignored. I've been in classrooms when somebody will ask a question and the teacher will ignore it, or other students won't pick up on it. Or when somebody makes a comment or raises an hypothesis, and for some reason, usually in classrooms I've seen it, it's when women do it. It's when women raise the question or posit a hypothesis that it just gets ignored. And then much later in the conversation, a man will say the same thing. And then of course it's brilliant and everybody picks up on it. So that could be an example of testimonial injustice as well. But it arises anytime you ask a question, offer an opinion or hypothesis, and it's disbelieved, ignored, or deflected or ridiculed because of that prejudice. So some examples of testimonial injustice, that are more traditional is when women say they've been harassed or, assaulted, they're often met with disbelief. When Black people say, they've been victims of racism or police misconduct, historically, they have been disbelieved. And when psychiatric survivors complain about, their treatment in the mental health system, they're not believed. Or when they say that, they're well, and some psychiatrist believes they're not believed. When they say they have a medication side effect, oftentimes psychiatric survivors feel that their side effects aren't taken seriously, or they're discounted or not believed. And there's another form of testimonial injustice that is called preemptive testimonial injustice. And that is when you don't even bother asking somebody their opinion. So an example from my own experience was during my medical malpractice trial, the jurors were actually allowed to ask witnesses questions. And one of the jurors asked the psychiatrist, my psychiatrist who was on trial for medical malpractice, what was Wilda's, meaning my, diet? And, this was a question that the juror could have easily asked me when I was on the witness stand, but did not, but instead asked the psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist, without even missing a beat, said that I, Wilda, was a lifelong vegan, which I'm not, which seems kind of odd too, that anyone from this American culture would be a lifelong vegan, because I'm well into my 60s. But despite how unlikely that was, the juror just accepted the answer because she gave that speaker an inflated level of credibility, and gave me no credibility by not even asking me the question. So that often happens with testimonial injustice, where you overcredit someone's credibility and under credit or deflate someone else's credibility based on testimonial injustice. In that case, preemptive, not even bothering to ask. Psychiatric survivors will also, experience this when policymakers, set out to make policy about them without including them. That's another example of preemptive testimonial injustice. So then we get to the other form of epistemic injustice, which is, I told you before, hermeneutical injustice. But before I can explain to you what hermeneutical injustice is, I need to talk to you about both hermeneutics and hermeneutical marginalization. The word hermeneutical comes from the word hermeneutics, which is the science of interpretation. It's how we make meaning out of things, particularly our experiences. And hermeneutical marginalization happens when a social group has an experience that is unique to that social group. And because of prejudice against that group, they've been denied the opportunity to participate in the creation of the concepts, the vocabulary, and the interpretive tropes necessary to understand, articulate, and share that experience with others. And when that's true, that group is said to be hermeneutically marginalized. So really kind of the best way to understand hermeneutical marginalization is hermeneutical injustice is through an example, and we'll get to that. But some examples of groups who have been kind of denied the opportunity to participate in the creation of these concepts, would be, women historically, members of, so-called racial minorities historically, and of course, people in the mental health system are seldom involved in research questions about themselves, to develop knowledge about themselves, separate and apart from what people who are more privileged in the society have developed and get people to accept. So hermeneutical injustice occurs. Of course, you have to have a hermeneutically marginalized group, and hermeneutical injustice occurs when prejudice denies that hermeneutically marginalized social group the opportunity to contribute to the pool of knowledge that allows human beings to make sense of and explain their experiences to themselves and others. So a couple examples of hermeneutical injustice. The classic one that Miranda Fricker talked about was sexual harassment. So the term sexual harassment is a really modern day term. It was invented in the 1970s. And even though sexual harassment occurred long before the 1970s, without the language to identify it, women really couldn't explain it or contest it. And so up until that time, women were hermeneutically marginalized, and they experienced this hermeneutical injustice because our society did not have this common pool of knowledge or even the vocabulary to talk about sexual harassment. There's another example that comes from the Black women. There's a famous case where Black women sued an automotive company because the company would not hire Black women. And their case ended up being thrown out of court because the company would hire white women as secretaries, and they would hire Black men as janitors, but they wouldn't hire Black women. But the court said, of course you can't be discriminated against as Black women because they hire women, but they're white, but they do hire women, and they hire men, Black men. Yeah, they're men, but they are Black. And so those women were kicked out of court and denied a remedy because the court had no understanding that Black women could be discriminated against as Black women, although Black women knew they could be discriminated against. And it wasn't until Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality that society began to understand the multiple ways that people can be discriminated against based not only just on sex alone, but on race and sex. And so up until that time, you could also say that women, Black women, who were denied those job opportunities because they were Black women, suffered hermeneutical injustice. And psychiatric survivors, and I'm using that term broadly now to just mean anyone in the mental health system who's been involved in the mental health system as a user of those services, are also hermeneutically marginalized and also suffer hermeneutical injustice because it's very difficult to explain our experiences of oppression and discrimination in the society at large, and particularly in the mental health system, because people don't have any understanding of what we're talking about, and we have yet to develop the vocabulary and the widespread pool of knowledge to let people know what we're talking about. So what is the harm of epistemic injustice? I've talked about a little of it. I talked about the women in that legal case not being able to pursue a race discrimination case because there was no conception of intersectionality, or women not being able to contest sexual harassment because they couldn't even name it. But it also, prevents people from participating in the democratic process. In order to be heard, you also have to be understood. And if you are hermeneutically marginalized because there's just no language or common pool of knowledge, you suffer greatly in a democratic society. And it can also keep people from getting needed resources like lawyers and doctors, because no one can understand whether you've been harmed or and are in need of some kind of redress. And Miranda Fricker, the person who coined the term epistemic injustice, makes a really compelling case that epistemic injustice actually prevents people from becoming who they are, which I think is one of the greatest injustices. So why have I spent all this time talking to you about epistemic injustice? Here's why. It's a case history. 54-year-old Black woman reports to her psychiatrist that she's concerned that she's experiencing mania and psychosis. The patient has a history of medication-induced mania and psychosis, and the patient has recently started a new medication that is known to cause mania and psychosis in some patients. The patient also reports that she's really troubled, and the reason she thinks she's psychotic and manic is because she gave a speech at a gala for incoming students to the law school where she teaches, telling the students not to attend because of racism at the school. So if this were, if I had an audience, I would open it up to you and ask, as clinicians or patients, what would your reaction be to a patient who came to you and shared this information? What would your response be to her? Well, this was the response to the psychiatrist that patient saw. This is a verbatim cut and pasted from the assessment and plan portion of that clinical note. The patient, he writes, the patient appears to be experiencing sound judgment in making decisions, seems to understand the risks, benefits, and consequences of her actions or behaviors. And in response to her being concerned about having made those remarks at the gala, he writes, he noted to her that many people who have experienced racism may stay quiet about it and not take action, but that she's different in a way because it's her calling to take action to address it. Now, what you need to understand here is that the patient was psychotic and manic. The patient, which the psychiatrist came to recognize maybe a year later, and the patient ended up destitute. She lost her job, lost her housing, lost her pension, basically lost everything because this psychiatrist chose to substitute his own opinion in place of the patient and chose not to believe the patient. So I would call this a classic case of testimonial injustice. The psychiatrist not believing the patient when she reported that she was manic and psychotic is such an obvious case of testimonial injustice. But not only did he not believe the patient, he substituted his own opinion for the subjective experiences of the patient. It's also a case of hermeneutical injustice because the patient came upset about her remarks at that gala, but the psychiatrist rationalized the behavior as something that she as a Black person would do, having experienced racism and having been called to address racism. No Black psychiatrist, I would say, or perhaps any psychiatrist with the knowledge of how Black people negotiate their professional lives would have reached this conclusion. How could she both work at a law school and tell students not to attend because of racism? So in this sense, the patient was harmed by the psychiatrist's ignorance about how Black professionals navigate white professional spaces. And while this information is widely known among Black professionals, owing to hermeneutical marginalization, it was not within society's common pool of knowledge sufficient to reach the awareness of this psychiatrist. And because of that, the patient was harmed. So, what's the takeaway here? The obvious takeaway is you need to believe your patients. You need to believe your clients. And you absolutely need to do so to err on the side of caution with something like, the harm of being wrong. If your patient really is manic and psychotic is great. And you also need to understand your patient's background, not your perception of the patient's background. And so in this case, the psychiatrist believed it was his perception that she was called to fight racism in this way. But the patient herself was telling him that she was troubled by her remarks. And for patients, what is the takeaway? Well, for something, if you know you have a history of mania and psychosis, you need a plan before those episodes occur. And you need a plan that includes both if your provider believes you and your provider doesn't believe you. And then obviously, if your clinician doesn't believe you, you need a new clinician. And maybe I shouldn't say obviously, because I think oftentimes once you start working with a clinician, you feel the switching costs are so great that you will stay with that clinician, even though there are things about that clinician that bother you. And I'm here to encourage you that you should really resist the urge to stay with someone that you have real doubts about. I know personally I did that, and I suffered greatly because of that. And so, if your clinician doesn't believe you, even about the small things, it's time for a new clinician. So now I want to move into the delivery of mental health care and talk about those three stages, beginning with intake. So here is a new case history. We have a 40-year-old Black female living in the San Francisco Bay Area who attends the first session of a group therapy run by an HMO psychotherapist. HMO is a health maintenance organization. And it's for patients who have received the diagnosis of depression. And after introducing herself to the group, the psychotherapist tells her that she may want to rethink whether she wants to continue with the group because the psychotherapist, is lily white. And this 40-year-old Black female is the only non-white person in the group. So again, if you were here, I would be asking you what your reactions are to this. What would you do what do you think about this as a therapist? And what do you think about this as a patient? But because you aren't here, I'll talk to you about what I thought about it as a patient. I was actually mortified and quite upset about it. Given my history in this society of being excluded from things based on race, my immediate reaction was I'm being excluded based on race. And obviously I didn't continue in this group, but I did feel greatly discriminated against and wronged, actually, on so many levels. But in retrospect, and after a lot of distance from this, and based on things that had happened after this with clinicians, I actually think that this clinician did me a great favor, because what the clinician was actually telling me was that he wasn't qualified to treat me because of his own limitations as he called it, lily white person. Now, I felt he could have handled it better by not saying that in front of everybody, calling me to the side, not putting the onus on me, but explaining, hey, because of my own racial prejudice, I don't think I can be a good clinician to you. And here are some recommendations about where you might be able to find a clinician that doesn't have my own limitations. That would have been perfectly acceptable. And I think that would have been actually helpful in the wise and prudent and professional responsible thing to do in that instance. But I want to take this opportunity to talk about other issues that I've seen during intake. And it's not only the question, are you qualified to treat this patient? Are you qualified? But also this issue, are you too eager? to treat this patient. That's a red flag. And the way I've seen this come up is when clinicians think they know so much about you just by looking at you. They'll want to always bring up the issue of race, even though you haven't brought it up. They will be kind of overly impressed with me, for example. Things that are, I think, very mundane and ordinary about me, they find extremely impressive. And of course, what I hear when they are impressed with something like, being a college graduate or something of that nature, or being an attorney, is, oh, you're impressed because I'm Black. Or, when they describe you as articulate is another kind of red flag for me. And for many Black people who think that they're described as articulate just because of the clinician's own low kind of opinion about how Black people express themselves. And so I would encourage you to avoid describing Black people as articulate, because it is a red flag for basically having low expectations of Black people. And this also can come up when clinicians Google their prospective patients before a session. And this happened to me. In fact, I had decided to seek out a therapist to help me deal with the fact that I did have a very large internet presence following having had a very public psychotic manic episode. And I was having difficulty because every place I went, they had already Googled me and they knew me through this psychotic manic episode. And I wanted some strategies for how to handle this. Well, the first clinician I went to had Googled me, even though they didn't know why I was coming. They had Googled me and then presumed the knowledge about me based on all the things that they had read on the internet. And I had a presence even before the psychotic manic episode because I was somewhat of a modest public figure in the Bay Area. And so I had a large internet footprint. But these people just assumed that they knew me, kind of based on the jobs that I've held. And I found it extremely off-putting. I really, you cannot build a therapeutic alliance with people who are Googling you and basing opinions about you on that. For patients and clinicians, you can test this out by things as simple as, do they know your name? Do they use your name? I had a clinician who would only call me counselor because I'm an attorney, I guess, and not my name, or others who would always call me Wanda when my name is Wilda. And then also there are things on the intake form that can give you a hint about the clinician's awareness of cultures different from their own. For example, how do they ask about race and ethnicity, or do they? Do they refer to you as, how do they refer to you? Do they refer to you as Black, African American, person of color, BIPOC, a term that I detest? And how do they ask questions about, how you were raised? And here's an example. So I went to a clinician who had an intake form that asked, are you a victim of child abuse? And I said no. And later in the relationship, I was talking about having been physically disciplined by my mother, being whipped or beaten or hit. And the practitioner, the clinician in that instance, accused me of lying on the intake form because I had not answered yes to the question about whether I had been a victim of child abuse. And what's important here is that, child rearing practices really vary by culture, and what's acceptable in one culture may not be acceptable in others. I'm in my mid-60s, and when I was growing up, corporal punishment was unfortunately an acceptable way to discipline children. And even I attended public schools in Harrisburg for a year or two, and school teachers were permitted to paddle students as a way of disciplining them. In fact, there was a paddle that hung from the blackboard in classrooms in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania when I attended school there. And so to assume that somebody who's been disciplined through corporal punishment is a victim of child abuse, and their failure to say that means that they were lying, betrays a cultural lack of a cultural awareness about just the world we live in. And so when I say cultural awareness, I'm not even talking about awareness of others' cultures. I'm talking about awareness of your own. You have to understand that your culture is not the center of the universe, and that there are other cultures, and you need to be, if you want to see people outside of your culture, you need to understand that your culture is just one culture and it's not the culture. And so another way that they could have asked the question about if they wanted to know whether you were physically disciplined, was to simply ask, how were you disciplined? And rather than, giving you things to check off in terms of race or ethnicity or gender, just leaving the question blank. If they want to know what your race is, they can just say, do you have a racial identity? Do you have a gender identity or a sex identity? Because there's a big difference between how the society identifies you and how that person identifies. And then, you should really think about, when you're asking these questions, why are you asking them? Why do you want to know what someone's race is? Because I've seen my race included in every single medical record I've ever seen, but I've never seen a practitioner take my race into account in a way that helps me. So I think you need to think about why you're asking that information and how you're going to take that information into account. And so I pretty much talked about the takeaways. One, if you can't be helpful to a prospective client, say that. Don't shift the onus of withdrawing to that patient or client. Be truthful, but say no more than necessary. And for patients and clients, if someone suggests they can't be helpful to you, you just need to accept it and not take it as a personal rejection of you. And if you have questions about why they're asking that, ask the questions rather than letting your thoughts go wild and imagining something that may not even be the case. And always, if somebody does something like what happened to me, make sure you process that experience with others who can be supportive rather than just internalizing that and let that eat away at you. So now we're going to move on to documentation. This was also taken from a medical record. It was the first intake. And so the psychologist was doing a mental status examination, and this is the results of that mental status examination. And there are two things I want to point out here. One is the reference under appearance to unusual, and also under the mental status comments, where the person writes, they actually wrote think. I believe the person meant thin. So thin Black woman with granny glasses and dreadlocks and a red hat. Thoughtful and serious, looking distinctly like Whoopi Goldberg, careful in what she says. Now, I don't know if you know what I'm trying to get at here, so I'm going to be very clear. First thing is, I'm not going to sit in a room with a clinician who describes my appearance as unusual. And the second thing is that, there was a time in our society when people tended to understand that it was inappropriate to say that all Black people look alike, and certainly inappropriate to suggest that all Black people look alike. And here, the clinician is suggesting that I look like Whoopi Goldberg. And so, a couple issues. What does that have to do with a mental status exam? That could only possibly be relevant, clinically relevant, if you thought the person was delusional, in which case you might want to say that rather than saying the person looks distinctly like Whoopi Goldberg. But basically, I certainly would not be continuing with a clinician who wrote a mental status exam that included this type of information. But this is not the only way biases happen in documentation. I've seen things like how you describe the patient, their hair, their race or ethnicity, their attire. You need to be very careful that you're using facts rather than adjectives, and also being very careful about why you're including the information in the first place. Another one that can be subject to misinterpretation by clients who are not part of kind of the dominant culture is when you may ask them about tobacco use or drug use, and you write in the record, patient denies drug use. I've had so many Black people tell me that they interpret that sentence as the clinician not believing them. And I've shared with them that I believe that's how clinicians write that, because I've heard doctors say they don't believe any of their patients. So, but you should understand that if you're going to write something like that, and the patient requests their records, which I encourage people to do, that they may misunderstand that, and it may interfere with your ability to form a productive therapeutic alliance with them. The other thing is being really careful about writing things that are based on your own values versus things that are facts. So I've seen in my medical records things such as patient is wearing men's pants or men's hat or men's shoes, which I see reflects only the clinician's values, because I don't shop in the men's department. All my clothes come from the women's department. But if a clinician, feels the need to write that in the medical record, I think what they're revealing to me is their own kind of gender biases. And another thing I've seen in medical records practice that I think really can really interfere and harm patients is when you are paraphrasing what a client or patient says, but you put it in quotes. And you need to be really careful about this, because it can be very off-putting and damaging and harmful to the patient. First, because you haven't heard correctly what the patient says. And secondly, because you're trying to pass off what you heard or how you're paraphrasing it as the patient's own words. And that could lead to a lack of trust from the patient, particularly if the patient is not from the dominant culture and is already pretty skeptical about this whole therapeutic relationship. So the takeaways here then are to avoid adjectives, just stick to the facts and think about why you're including what you're including, and is it clinically necessary. Avoid quotation marks unless you truly are quoting somebody verbatim. And unless you're certain of the meaning of certain words, particularly descriptive words about Black people's hair, you should just avoid it. The example here is, I've read my hair described in various medical records as braids or extensions, sometimes dreadlocks, but rarely. And there's a big distinction between all of those. Particularly, extensions are hair that you buy and weave into your hair. And people who have dreadlocks really take pride in having natural hair, their own hair. And so not only is it inaccurate, it could also just offend your patient if you, thinking that you are in the know, don't know, and describe someone who's wearing dreadlocks or locks as extensions. For patients and clients, I would suggest that you request and review your medical records. And when I'm using medical records, I'm including your mental health records periodically. And also to appreciate the limitations and purposes of documentation. And if you have concerns, to raise them directly with your clinician and not just, ruminate about them and sulk about them. But the therapeutic process is all about that dialogue, and no conversation should be off limits. And so if you have questions about something that a clinician has written in your records, you should ask about that. And you should ask for corrections when necessary, because that is your legal right. So now we're going to move on to another case history in the diagnosis realm. This is a 54-year-old Black female patient reports to her psychiatrist being targeted by a police officer in her affluent San Francisco neighborhood because she is Black. The patient reported that she had just left her neighborhood wash and fold. And for those Vermonters who don't know what a wash and fold is, that is a place where you can drop your laundry off and get other people to do it for you. So she just left her neighborhood wash and fold when a police officer approached and asked for her driver's license, reportedly because someone in the neighborhood had reported a Black man with dreadlocks going door to door asking for money. The patient, who was an attorney, refused to show her license because she considered the request unlawful and didn't want to reach in her purse for fear of her wallet being mistaken for a weapon. So again, I would ask you what your reactions are. Because you're not here, I'll just move on to what this particular psychiatrist in this case did with this information. He diagnosed her with a personality disorder and used this report of the interaction with the law enforcement officer as to support that diagnosis. So the diagnosis was personality disorder, not otherwise specified, paranoid, and narcissistic. And so he writes that he has tried on multiple occasions for the patient to examine her mind and the templates it carries as a victim, and create the lens through which she sees the world. And he says in this most recent example, she was asked by a police officer to show an identification, and he wondered aloud if the patient could suppress her negative emotions and do what society expects one to do in such circumstances. He shared his own personal experience that he wouldn't enjoy that situation, but he would think to himself that it was the police officer's job. He had been given a description of a Black man in dreadlocks going door to door asking for money, and it was his responsibility to give the officer his identification. Then he writes, as soon as he spoke from his perspective about how he might handle the situation, the patient became defensive and talked about how she did not want to be humiliated in front of her office building and did not want to risk reaching for anything for risk of getting fired at. So a couple of things here. One, the patient is an attorney, and the patient is also aware of the law that police officers can't ask for licenses unless they have a reasonable suspicion that the person has created a crime. Here, the patient does not match the description. The patient is a female, and they were looking for a Black male. And more importantly, going door to door asking for money is not a crime. And so on that basis, the patient refused to give her identification, in addition to being concerned about reaching for things in her purse. And also what this happened in San Francisco, and what San Francisco police officers like to do is have people sit on the curb while they're going through the wallets and stuff, and and then kind of people gawking as they go by. And this patient felt like he didn't have a right to ask for the identification, and she wasn't about to sit on the curb while he went through her purse. Again, if you were here, I would ask for your reactions, but you're not here. And so I'll move on to what happened next. So basically, the patient's disability insurance company asked two independent medical examiners to review the patient's medical records and make a determination about whether the patient had a personality disorder. And this is what one of the doctors who weighed in on that question said. Why does Dr. Shermanian not recognize any of the numerous contextual factors that might explain why an African-American lawyer working at a Center for Social Justice would choose to take a principled stand against being targeted in an incident of racial profiling? Furthermore, he appears to imply that her fear of being shot by policemen is an example of paranoia. This suggests to me that Dr. Subramanian may not be fully aware of the historic relationship between law enforcement and the African-American community in the United States? Is he aware of how events from both 20th century and recent modern American history would make a patient's fear of being shot by police a legitimate concern and not evidence of paranoia? The incident described is, in my opinion, completely inappropriate to use in support of a diagnosis of personality disorder. It is my opinion that, contrary to what Dr. Subramanian suggests, this incident demonstrates integrity and courage on the part of the patient and not a deficit. So because Dr. Subramanian's name appears in that medical note, I decided to just make it clear to you that this is a photo of Dr. Subramanian. He was born and raised in the United States in the Midwest. He graduated from Harvard Medical School. He's in his 40s. He practices as in private practice in San Francisco. And he did a residency at UC San Francisco. So he cannot be using as an excuse the fact that he didn't grow up in this country or is unaware of its history. And he also expresses a clinical interest in diagnosing personality disorders and how they affect the expression of mood and anxiety disorders. So he considers himself an expert in this area. So obviously, I don't need to belabor this. I think the second opinion on the personality diagnosis pretty much tells you what I want to say are the takeaways. And that is, you need to consider context when making diagnoses. It's really not relevant what Dr. Subramanian would do if he were stopped by a police officer. It's really more relevant whether the patient's response is appropriate given how that patient is positioned and situated in our society. And for patients, it may be difficult to avoid harm from diagnoses that don't take race into account, unless you really do a lot of work up front to avoid entering in these relationships with practitioners who do not know how to take your race or gender or other things about you into account. But I can say that once you've been harmed, you really need to find safety, and that I found safety in other mental health practitioners who offered second opinions and encouragement and criticism of Dr. Subramanian. And then the final case history is about treatment. So here is a 53-year-old Black female who reports to her psychotherapist having problems at work. She runs a racial justice center at a law school in which she is the only non-white employee. And her supervisor gave her a poor performance review. The patient had never before in her life or career received a poor performance review. And the performance review described the patient as brusque, combative, and intimidating. And the supervisor said that none of the patient's, faculty colleagues liked her. And when she asked the supervisor, like, who did she talk to, the supervisor said that they had requested anonymity, and she discouraged the patient from reaching out to her colleagues to discuss the matter with them. So the patient was very devastated about the performance evaluation and came to this psychotherapist for help in managing it. And so what this psychiatrist, who was also a psychotherapist, according to him, did was diagnose the patient with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which triggered, he prescribed a stimulant. That stimulant triggered a psychotic manic episode that went undiagnosed and untreated, and the patient ended up destitute. So it was later revealed that the performance review was actually a misrepresentation of the patient's colleagues. Her colleagues had in fact given her a very favorable performance review and very much liked her and respected her work. As it turned out, the performance review was the result of the racial politics in the workplace. And what this psychiatrist, psychotherapist didn't understand or take into account is that performance reviews of women and people from racial minorities, research has shown that more often than not, rather than reviewing the performance of women and racial people who are in racial minorities, performance reviews review their personalities. And so that should have been kind of the first hint to this psychiatrist, psychotherapist, that he shouldn't take at face value the performance evaluation. So the takeaways here are the dynamics of race, sex, gender, et cetera, must always stay top of mind during diagnosis and treatment. And you really do need, as a clinician, to familiarize yourself with the research literature about how race and gender and sex, how those dynamics play out in the workplace, and what patients or your clients might have to endure because of racism or sexism or homophobia or xenophobia. And for clients and patients, you really need to be wary of clinicians who question your perceptions of race or gender bias. If you say that you think you think something that happened to you as a result of your racial bias, and they say, well, are you sure in this day and age? Things that this clinician said to me, that should be a tip off that this is not a sophisticated practitioner and is probably unqualified to be assisting you. And so before beginning work with a clinician, or even now if you're in a therapeutic relationship and want to understand your clinician's understanding, you should ask questions about how they think about mental health at the intersection of race and sex and gender dynamics. And you shouldn't accept glib answers. If you have a clinician who says that they're colorblind, or they don't see color, or they treat everybody the same, or they base everything on the content of their character, these are good evidence that this is not going to be an effective clinician if you're having to deal with race and gender and homophobia in your life. Because as I've hoped to have demonstrated here today is the clinician does need to see your race, your gender, your sexuality in order to be an effective clinician for you. That is not to say that they should assume they know who you are based on how the society has labeled you based on your race, but they should know that the society has labeled you and that will have some impact on you, and they should be curious about what impact that is actually having on you. So there's a difference between thinking that you know who your patient is based on what you can see, and actually understanding something about some of your patient's experiences, maybe because of how they're situated in our society. You want people who are willing and able to understand that despite all of our best intentions, race and gender bias are always operational in some way, and they should be willing to engage in a dialogue with you about how they may be operating in your particular case. So this is an opportunity for question and answer. And so what I've done is just taken a couple questions that had been left in the chat when I did this presentation live. And one of the first questions was, any comments about working with kids and family? That's a really big question, and it's something that I actually was going to put in the main presentation, but it was so big, it got left out. My oldest brother was the first person in my family who was diagnosed with a mental illness. And I subsequently became his guardian after my mother died. And I had access to all of his medical records from the very first time he saw a clinician. And I was just amazed at how the clinician's failure to take seriously my mother's concerns about race and racism and mental illness really adversely affected my brother's treatment and really the outcome that he might otherwise have had if the petitioner had been more knowledgeable about how to deal with and respond to my mother's complaints about mental illness and race. And so unless you have experience dealing with mental illness, I would have to say that most families don't have any knowledge about mental illness, and in most Black families, the only thing we know about it is what we see on TV or in the movies, and what we see on TV and in the movies is not something we want in our families. And so I think even if you are, you have to really start at the very beginning. You can't assume that if somebody comes to therapy, they actually know what therapy is. I think you need to explain to them how it's supposed to work. And the other thing is, I think if you are going to be delivering some news that a child has, you think, a mental illness, that you need to be really careful in how you deliver that news. You need to explain more than you might otherwise what that means. You need to be able to talk to them knowledgeably about the conflation of mental illness and racism in our society, understanding how, runaway slaves were diagnosed with a mental illness, how, psychiatrists, psychotherapists at the turn of the century said that Black people were psychologically unfit for freedom. You have to acknowledge all that history. And then you have to paint a more positive picture about what this might mean for that child, for that family. And references to literature, references to, movies, and people. It's really important if you can refer them to other people who have gone through this and have successfully navigated whatever diagnosis that you are, proposing fits this child. But it really is going to depend on how much trust you build, how much knowledge of you can display, particularly at the intersection of mental illness and race, and how seriously you take the complaints that you may hear, where they don't want a white person, calling their child crazy. And so, or even a Black person, they don't want anyone calling their child crazy. They don't want the medical profession doing it. And so that's a short answer now. Next question. We have a lot of interest in our provider network about training on how to ask about race and culture at intake and assessment, and worry about misstepping. I don't think you can collect all the information you may need on this area necessarily at intake. I think as you build the therapeutic alliance, more information will be revealed. What you need to do is avoid making assumptions about people based on what you think the person's racial identity is. For example, I was in couples therapy, and I was with my partner. We're having conflicts around money. She wanted to spend more money than I did. I wanted to save, she wanted to spend. And the couples therapist made the comment that was probably because I grew up poor and my partner grew up wealthy, which in fact was not the case. While I certainly didn't grow up wealthy, I didn't grow up poor. And my partner pointed out that I actually had more access to affluence than she did. I was educated in private schools and, had wealthy friends who, took me on vacations and blah, blah, blah. And I ended up asking that, couples therapist why he assumed that I grew up poor. And, he said, oh, I guess because you're Black. So those are kind of things you want to avoid. You want to avoid just those assumptions. And you also want to be careful in how you ask the questions. So I'll give you another example. I was sharing with a psychotherapist the first time I found out that I was Black and that meant something in this society. And so a classmate had told me that I was colored and she couldn't play with me anymore because colored people were bad. And so I went home and I told my mother what happened, and I asked my mother if I was, colored, and my mother started crying. And the clinician stopped me and said, "Was your mother crying?" Oh, he didn't ask me whether my mother was crying. He goes, "Your mother was crying because she was ashamed." It was some kind of a comment question. And I was extremely put off by the question, especially if you know my mother, who's this extremely powerful, a brilliant Black woman who's, I've never seen her express any shame around being Black, just a lot of pride and power. And I just felt like the question really reflected the clinician's own views about Black people. Maybe should be ashamed, or that was what they overly focused on, the shame piece. And so, a better way to ask that question would have been, do you know why your mother was crying? So I give you those examples to say, you need to be curious and ask open-ended questions that don't suggest and reveal your own biases. But you can't expect this all to happen in the initial intake, but you'll get more and more information as you build the alliance, and as you do express curiosity, rather than assuming that you know something about that particular patient and client. So I guess early in the presentation, I said I detested the term BIPOC. There's a question that says, could you please expand on your comment about designation BIPOC? What would be more appropriate language for a white person who's talking about historically marginalized group? And so what I would say here is that, as somebody who's in her mid-60s, I have been called everything from colored, which is on my birth certificate, to Negro, to Afro-American, Black, African-American, person of color, and now BIPOC. And frankly, I'm just sick of it. I'm sick of these labels. I'm sick of the objectification that these labels represent. I'm sick of the centering of white people that the labels represent. And so that's kind of my personal primary feelings about these labels. I also think that for the term BIPOC, to put into one term groups of people who have very distinct histories and then calling them a community is just ahistorical and wrong. And again, centers white people, and again, is just a shorthand way of objectifying and dismissing people. I think that, if you want a synonym for talking about people who are historically marginalized, you might just say historically marginalized and explain what you mean by that. I think, people should be represented in their full humanity, and that it should be a mouthful. I don't think we should use the shorthand BIPOC to talk about people or their experiences. And the last question was, how do you still have any faith in the medical system? I actually have no faith in the medical system, and I've left the medical system. I don't use doctors or psychiatrists or psychotherapists or medications simply because of my experience. It has been extremely harmful, and I'm healing myself. So with that, I appreciate your attention to this presentation. If you want to reach out to me and have questions, you can reach me at my email address, which is my first name, Wilda, WILDA, @wildawhite.com.